One world currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am back. The show is live. It is May 18th, 2012. I am back in the saddle again. I want to thank you all for listening Wednesday and being cool with Joe and Tim and hanging out with them while they covered for me. Literally, when I came on air and I said hello to everybody, I had literally walked into the studio about 10 minutes prior. And I'd just gotten out of the hospital, literally off the operating room table, less than 3 hours fresh before. So I was a little cranky, and those guys were awesome. I mean, those are two good friends. They you know, we had planned like a week in advance they were going to cover for me, but I really appreciate Tim and Joe sitting in for me Wednesday. So big shout out, thank you very much. But I am back in the saddle. Surgery and a cast cannot stop me from fighting the New World Order. And as I promised, tonight's guest is a good friend of the show, a awesome researcher, radio show host, and probably one of the foremost experts on the JFK assassination you could ever, if you ever need any information about the JFK assassination, he is one of the very few people I would recommend you go talk to. I am proud to welcome back to the show the legendary Professor James Fetzer. Jim, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Popeye, it's great to be back with you. I always enjoy it.
And recently, in between our, today's show and the last time you were on, you hung out with me. You were, how shall we say, I guess, dissed or pretty much disrespected at the very least by Ed Schultz. And we're going to get into a few other things, but right now I want to cover that really quick because I thought how they handled you, especially considering he gave you the time to speak on air. It goes to show that they don't want the truth out. And it wasn't that they thought you were some kook or anything. You could see that obviously it was the content of what you were bringing forward. So why don't you tell the listeners what happened to you?
Well, it was 2 weeks ago yesterday. It was on Thursday, May 3rd, Popeye, when I was listening to Ed. And here he's broadcast in Madison over 92.1 FM. And I frequently listen to him. I think he's a good guy. He's been very supportive of the labor movement and what's been going on here in Wisconsin, where I now reside, in relation to our recall election and all that. And he was talking about, among other things, about the mission accomplished fiasco on the USS Abraham Lincoln, where they had all this falderah, big to-do. George Bush allegedly flew in wearing a flight suit, and yet it fizzled, really. Nothing significant was accomplished, much less the mission. And, of course, since that event, which occurred back in 2003, we have had probably a minimum of 5,000 additional American deaths. The war has gone on. They talk about pulling back now from Iraq. But the situation's a mess. And, things aren't any better in Afghanistan. And I've got quite a bit to add about why we're still in Afghanistan and why Barack Obama is talking about our being there until 2024, which is certainly absurd from a military point of view, but perhaps not from another perspective, which I shall explain. So Ed was talking about how bizarre it was that this mission accomplished thing had fizzled. Well, I happen to know a great deal about it because I had interviewed the mother of the B-1 bomber pilot who'd actually taken out Saddam, his two sons, and about 60 members of his general staff at a restaurant in the suburbs of Baghdad on 7 April 2003. That was only about 3 weeks into the invasion. And just imagine, if he'd actually announced this, how the country would have rejoiced. The event would have made great sense. So I called in, and I called in at 11:25 in the morning. And I told the screener what I wanted to say. I mean, I was fortunate to make a connection. This is maybe the fourth time I've been on Ed's show. And the screener listened to what I had to say and said, get me on, okay, and told me, you don't waste a lot of time with preliminaries, get to what you want to say. So he finally got me on about 5 minutes of. And I said to Ed, and this is a reconstruction, but it's highly accurate to the best of my recollection. Ed, I said, the mission accomplished event was originally planned to announce that U.S. Air Force Captain Chris Wachter had taken out Saddam Hussein, his two sons, and around 60 members of his general staff at a restaurant in the suburbs of Baghdad with his B-1 bomber. When he returned to the base, he was lionized, put on CNN, and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Someone in the administration must have realized that three presidents, Reagan, Carter, and Ford, had signed executive orders prohibiting the assassination of heads of foreign states. He was brought back to Washington and told that while they admired his flying skills officially, Saddam Hussein had gotten away, where they used one of his doubles for the trial. And Ed, in response to this, Popeye sounded genuinely excited. He said, wow, I want you to stay over and talk more after the break. This may be one of those Paul Harvey moments where now you know the rest of the story. Well, that sounded pretty good to me, so I hung on the phone. I was on my cell phone. And when he came back from the break and started to talk to Alan Grayson, who's a Democrat running for Congress down in Florida, that didn't bother me at all. But after he was done with Grayson, which took about 20 minutes, he started taking calls for others. And would you believe me, Popeye, I stayed on that phone from noon until 1:15 before I realized that this was a complete finesse, that whether it was his producer or Ed, they had made the decision not to have me back. It was just too hot to handle. Actually, after I got off finally hung up from being on the cell phone for, an hour and 20 minutes altogether, I returned a call that had come to me while I was waiting from a friend who has a very terrific restaurant here in Madison called The Weary Traveler. If you're ever in town, you ought to check it out. And he told me, when I explained what had happened with Ed, that when Ed Schultz had come here to Madison in relation to all this to-do and with the unions and all that he'd actually talked with his producer, and that the producer had told him that they weren't into New World Order issues, 9/11 and all that. So, the picture became clear that, to my utter dismay, Ed Schultz, whom I have heretofore admired, turns out to be one more left-wing gatekeeper when it comes to 9/11 and related issues. And frankly, Popeye, it completely disgusts me. I have now published 2 articles about it on Veterans Today. One is entitled, Ouch, Ed Schultz is a phony and a fraud. The other is entitled, Ed Schultz and the Mission Accomplished Fiasco. where I knew a tremendous amount about this. When his mother had first contacted me because I had my show, and this was years ago, I had told her that it was a terrific story, but I really needed to have a lot of documentation. Well,
when you say his, you mean the pilot?
Yes, the pilot. She told me what had happened and that it had been her son who had actually taken out Saddam and how he'd been called back to Washington and told that officially Saddam got away. And I said, well, look, Yvonne, I said, I'd really like to do this, but I need to have a lot of documentation. Well, she'd been a former legal stenographer, Popeye, and she turned out to be brilliant at research.
I'm going to cut you off right there, Jim, and we can pick up with Yvonne on the other side of the break because the break's coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. 3 minutes. Jim and I will be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. So, Jim, before we went to break, you were discussing Yvonne, who is the pilot's mother.
That's right.
And you were saying how you were explaining that she's, a good researcher and stuff. So go ahead and pick up from there.
Yeah, well, I wanted to do the story, but I had to have a lot of substantiation, and she turned out to be a wizard, absolutely an effing wizard at research. I was just blown away, Popeye. And if you were to go to 911scholars.org, which is the homepage for Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and if you were to scroll down to one of the sections toward the bottom entitled The Mission Accomplished Fiasco, you'd find document after document that she sent to me, plus other articles I'd turned up on my own. And we had so much great stuff that I, invited her on the show, and we did this terrific interview about it. Subsequently, Maria Heller would pick up on it and have the two of us on together. So it's also been featured on the Maria show. And when I finished with this thing with Ed and discovered, I'd been really left hanging high and dry, I wrote a letter to Ed on Friday, the 4th of May, and sent him a link to the article. And what I wrote was this: Ed, my belief in you took a heavy hit on Thursday when you asked me to stay over for the next hour so we could talk about the mission accomplished fiasco. I stayed on my cell phone for an hour and 15 minutes before I got the message that you were playing me. Frankly, I found that rather disgusting. Here I was explaining one of the great con jobs of the war on terror. You were initially responsive, but it took me an hour and 15 to get it through my head that you were not going to have me back to elaborate after all. That was very bad. I am a former commissioned officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, Ed. I earned my Ph.D. in the history and the philosophy of science. I have published 29 books and hundreds of articles until you left me high and dry. I was a huge fan of Ed Schultz. See the proof below. And below, I gave him the links to all these articles, including, get this, Popeye, this is like my favorite. There's this very famous church in Anaheim, California, which is in Orange County, maybe the most conservative county in all of California, where the Reverend Robert Schiller has presided in the Crystal Cathedral. His services are so famous that they're televised whenever he performs them. I believe today he's retired and his son now is officiating, or something else has become of the Crystal Cathedral, which Yvonne mentioned to me. But she had sent me a video of the Reverend Schiller honoring Chris Wachter for his success in bombing that restaurant in Baghdad and taking out Saddam and his two sons and 60 members of his general staff already on 7 April 2003. So you can actually watch it. I have it linked there. I figured that the agencies were going to go through and try to scuttle all the links, but enough of them seem to be still working. And in particular, I had separately downloaded this so that they couldn't simply cut that line because it's so fascinating to watch. So if you go on there, you can not only see, Chris Wachter, all the evidence we have of Chris having done what his mother attributes to him, you'll now begin to understand why the mission accomplished event turned out to be such a fiasco. And you'll have new insight, by the way, into how the media operates as gatekeeper, suppressing information, even about something as vital as this. You'd think that Ed Schultz believes the American people are not entitled to know the truth about their own history, even about recent events like the death of Saddam Hussein, who was indeed replaced by one of his doubles. So that, in fact, Yvonne and I continue to discuss this and publish a second piece entitled Ed Schultz and the Mission Accomplished Fiasco, where we demonstrate the use of the double in place of Saddam and how it was all done. I mean, really stunning stuff, and include a transcript from Maria, being on with Maria, because she had me back to talk about this. I'm just so disappointed, Popeye, because I thought if there was anyone out there who was clean as a whistle, it was Ed Schultz.
No, he's a gatekeeping scumbag. From now on, Jim, just contact me anytime you're not sure if someone's a scumbag, and I'm good at weeding out the dirt bags. I'll just be like, no, good, yay, yay or nay. And most of it is nay. So
well, I'll tell you what happened. Yvonne listened to his show on Monday. This is, I was on Thursday. I wrote this article and published it Friday, sent him the letter and all that. And she had listened to the show on Monday, and she said Ed came on in a very foul mood. And he started talking about how there are people out there who think that George Bush and Dick Cheney should be tried as war criminals, and that he had then said very derisively that they are conspiracy theorists. This is so ridiculous. We're not conspiracy theorists. We're doing all this research. We're conspiracy realists. We deal with evidence. The government has been lying to us, in this case about the death of Saddam Hussein. It lied about weapons of mass destruction. It lied about Osama bin Laden in relation to 9/11, where eventually the FBI itself would acknowledge that it had no hard evidence that tied Osama bin Laden to 9/11. Even this latest event of attacking the compound in Pakistan, where Obama has claimed credit for killing Osama bin Laden, is another farce, Popeye. Actually, Osama bin Laden died on or about 15 December 2001 in Afghanistan. He was buried in an unmarked grave in accordance with Muslim tradition. There were local obituaries. Even Fox News reported it the Tuesday after his death. David Ray Griffin has published a whole book about it entitled Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive, which was published in 2009. They trot this guy out. You can't kill a dead man, after all, Popeye. And for them to claim, that it was this op in Pakistan. See, what was going on was Obama was under pressure because he hadn't closed Guantanamo. He was under pressure because he had troops stationed in Pakistan. He was under pressure because his birth certificate was a very live issue. So at a single fell swoop, by claiming that the tip as to Osama bin Laden's location had come from Guantanamo, which is ridiculous, that he was able to use the troops in Pakistan and claim that, since they were there, it was a good thing because he was able to use them for this purpose. They staged a phony event where members of the cabinet, including Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama, were watching a big screen intently as though they were following the event live. Articles were published about it, touting it, that how they'd watched it live. But Leon Panetta, then the director of CIA, pointed out that there'd been no coverage of the event for the first 20 or 25 minutes. Well, these events only take about 5 minutes. So, Popeye, so this blew their cover. It meant the whole thing was a sham and a fraud purely for political purposes. So if you want to know if Barack Obama is as big a liar and deceiver as George W. Bush, I think the answer is emphatically that he is. And, of course, that he went ahead to sign the National Defense Authorization Act for 2012, which further gutted the Bill of Rights, that he has never repealed the Patriot Act, that he has allowed the Military Commissions Act to stand, that he hasn't closed Guantanamo, shows me this guy was not the candidate I supported, whom I sent $100 to on 5 different occasions, Popeye, and it wasn't the same $100. He had this background in the law. He had been at Harvard Law. He'd been the head of the Harvard Law Review. He taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. I thought he was a perfect guy.
What did his wife get disbarred for? Wasn't it like fraud or something she got disbarred for?
Oh, I'd be shocked if that were the case. Michelle, I didn't even know Michelle's is Michelle actually an attorney?
Well, not anymore. She's been disbarred. I'll have to look it up and I'll find out. We're coming to the break, so I'll look it up there in the break. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere because Jim's got some new, well, I don't know if it's brand new, but some information that has not really been brought to light as to why they keep pushing to stay in Afghanistan. It's something that isn't talked about much, and he's going to get into that. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a few minutes. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. And before we get into Afghanistan really quick, I just I wanted Jim to cover really quick what happened to Saddam, because he had said that there was a fiasco, but we kind of neglected to explain what happened really quick. And we've gone into detail on other shows, but Jim's going to tell you what happened really quick, and then he's going to get into Afghanistan. So go ahead, Jim. Floor's yours.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to explain to Ed when we came back on, which of course never came to pass, was that they'd been able to track him because he had these custom-made Jaguar telephones made in the UK, and they were able to triangulate his position so that when Chris Wachter was out there piloting his B-1 bomber, he got contact with information and the coordinates telling him this was the big one. They gave him the coordinates. They told him not to miss. He dropped two JDAM bombs on this restaurant, which are bunker buster types, and just obliterated the restaurant. In fact, one of the features of these articles is I show you the restaurant before and the restaurant after. And among the articles we have include one from the New York Times quoting Dick Cheney as saying how they dragged his lifeless body out of the rubble. And there were other stories that had been reported about the time. I show you how we were able to establish that the double was, in fact, not Saddam himself, because he had different facial features and a different bite, where Saddam had several doubles. I mean, this is really a great story to study, because it shows how duplicitous the government can be, how it can manufacture evidence, how it can fake information about even the most significant events. As you well know, Obama claimed that they had killed Saddam. In fact, the local residents had never heard of Saddam. They had no reason to believe he was there. There was a phony photograph put out of the guy who actually owned the building holding a clicker to watch a TV, and it was taken from behind, so you could sort of vaguely presume that it was Osama, but of course it was not. They have faked a vast variety of photographs about his death. If you go on to, I think, whatreallyhappened.com, there's a series under the heading of a gallery of fake dead bin Ladens. And you'll see a whole host of photographs about how they're faking it. There's an article on my blog by Nick Kollerstrom entitled Osama bin Laden 1957 to 2001. And he traces the story about bin Laden, you know, the accurate, truthful story. But this whole thing is just such a sham, you know, I mean, that the government is going to lie. I mean, they lie about virtually every major event in recent American history, as everyone knows. They lied about Lee Oswald as a lone assassin at JFK, and there's been interesting new developments in relation to that, which we can talk about after we talk about Afghanistan, if you like, Popeye. And, of course, they lied about the reasons to go to war. In fact, it's rather stunning, as you'll hear when I talk about Afghanistan, as to how primed they were to go into Afghanistan. Paul O'Neill, who was Bush's first Secretary of the Treasury, said how at the very first cabinet meeting they were talking about invading Iraq. Well, that first cabinet meeting would have been presumably like in January of 2001. And 9/11, of course, had not yet occurred. And a lot of things would take place to set up for 9/11, such as in June, changing the standard operating procedures for responses by the U.S. Air Force to reported hijackings, where instead of very commanders having the authority to send up the planes and even shoot down the commercial carriers if necessary, now everything had to be routed through the Secretary of Defense for his personal approval. And not only was the U.S. Air Force completely out of action, Webster Tarpley in his book, 9/11, Synthetic Terror Made in the USA, in its more recent editions, documents anywhere from 17 to 24 or more mini terrorist drills. You know, some were big, some were smaller scale. It was like a patchwork quilt to make sure no planes would go up there. And frankly, I'm now convinced, Popeye, it's because they didn't want planes to go up to response to reported hijackings and find that there was nothing there. I mean, a sure sign that this was all phony is that they had all these blips from these phony drills on the air traffic controller screens, and even after it was reported that these were supposed to be bona fide hijackings, they left them on the radar screens, okay? If this had been the real deal, if this hadn't been a fraud perpetrated by the government, they would have removed them so you could see what real planes were actually in the sky. But in fact, we know two of these planes, Flights 11 and 77, were not even scheduled to fly that day. And Pilots for 9/11 Truth has established by the study of air-ground communications that Flight 93 was in the air, but at the very time it was supposed to be crashing in Shanksville, it was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and that Flight 175 was also in the air, but at the very time it was supposed to be effortlessly entering the South Tower, it was actually over Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, I mean, you know, the degree of duplicity involved here is absolutely stunning. Anyone who may listen in disbelief to what I'm telling you should go to two articles of mine. There are at least actually four recent ones about all of this, but the two in particular, one is entitled Planes, No Planes, and Video Fakery, where what I mean by video fakery is any use of video to convey a false impression about what happened, which means you don't necessarily have to be altering the videos per se, but it may be that you're actually filming faked or simulated aircraft, which appears to be the case for both the hit of Flight 11, remember, wasn't even in the air, hitting the North Tower by this French film crew, where a fellow named Leslie Raphael, a Scottish scholar, has discovered more than 100 improbable coincidences that had to be satisfied for that film crew to be in exactly the right position to film that hit. And yet there are any number of revealing anomalies that I discover in that article. And where Flight 175 is not only traveling faster than a standard 767, although both of those planes were supposed to be Boeing 767s, but enters the building effortlessly in violation of Newton's laws. There's no collision effects whatsoever. In fact, you can do a frame-by-frame count, and you discover that the plane passes its entire length into the building in the same number of frames it passes to its own entire length in air, and yet it's intersecting with 8 different floors in the case of the South Tower, 7 different floors in the case of the North, where each of those floors, Popeye, consists of a steel truss filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. In other words, represents about an acre of concrete apiece, representing massive horizontal resistance. I mean, imagine if you know the damage that a small bird that only weighs a few ounces can do to the fuselage of an aircraft when it's encountered in flight. Imagine what would happen if it were to encounter a steel truss filled with an acre of concrete, just one of them, and here it was intersecting with 8. So the whole situation is completely preposterous. And the question becomes exactly how they did it, which is something that I examine.
Well, see, that's what I was going to ask, because a lot of people are afraid to even talk about this. I find this to be one of the most contentious issues in the 9/11 truth movement. I'm doing air quotes when I say that. People don't. I say, look at all the evidence, and I'm not saying, like I said to you, I don't know. I really don't think that whatever hit them was fake. My own personal experience, plus things, pictures I saw and pictures I have and stuff. I think something hit them. What I don't know. I know they could have, used some sort of drone and dressed it up to look like a civilian aircraft. I mean, even pilots.
Yeah, but Popeye, the point is it was not Flight 175.
No, I completely agree. It was not what they said it was. And
well, that's right. That's the whole idea. That no planes theory doesn't mean there weren't any flying objects. We know, for example.
That's why I wanted to clarify that, because you know how contentious it is, Jim.
People don't even bother to read the studies that explain what it means. I mean, the second article of mine is entitled Reason and Rationality in Public Debate, the Case of Rob Basalmo. Here, this guy is the head of Pilots for 9/11 Truth. His own organization has established not only that the plane seen in the videos that's supposed to be Flight 175, a Boeing 767, is traveling faster than aerodynamically possible at that altitude for a standard Boeing 767. Plus, they've established, based on their study of air-ground communication, that Flight 175 was actually in the air, but over Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, it's rather apparent. It isn't rocket science to recognize the same plane can't be in 2 places at the same time. So if Flight 175 was over Pittsburgh, it wasn't entering the South Tower. If it wasn't entering the South Tower, then if something was entering the South Tower or something appeared to be entering the South Tower, it cannot have been Flight 175. Now, Rob Balsamo should know all that. I've actually explained it to him during rather extended discussions on forums at Pilots, and yet he denies that Pilots buys into video fakery. Well, why should they not buy into video fakery?
Jim, I'm going to cut you off right there, and we'll pick up with this on the other side of the break. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. I want to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to straighten this out once and for all. All right, I'm getting into this because once and for all, I'm tired of all the misconceptions when you try to have a conversation with somebody about this. And again, a lot of that is because you have disinformation being purposely put out there, and people purposely go in there and foment arguments and stuff, which happens all the time.
That's right.
Jim said the video fakery theory does not mean, and even the no plane theory does not mean that there wasn't something that physically flew in. What they're saying is it was not a commercial aircraft that hit the building. And I have to say, after watching, Jim, I was on the fence about what it was. But when I watched the pilots for 9/11 Truth stuff, I purchased their stuff from them, and there's a ton of movies you can get from them. There's like 4 or 5 of them, and when you sit and watch it, and you just watch, now these guys are professional pilots, former military pilots, and they all say it is physically impossible for a civilian jet to have pulled off, for instance, in the case of the Pentagon, to have pulled off that loop-the-loop the way it was. So they had to have been something else. Now. What they were, I think the only way we'll find out eventually really what they were is to get into the stuff that's locked away in that vault.
No. Popeye, look, I've sorted it out. I didn't do it all on my own, and I had to be beat up to even get into it. But if you go and look at these 2 articles, you'll understand what happened. Now, it's an elementary principle of identity that the same macroscopic physical object cannot be in 2 places at the same time. If Flight 175 was over Pittsburgh at the same time it was supposed to be entering the South Tower, then we're not talking about the same plane being in 2 places, but some kind of fakery going on in New York, because Pilots has established that Flight 175 was over Pittsburgh. Now, what that means is, if you understand the meaning of the word video fakery as I use it, it means any use of video to convey a false impression. And you could do that by having, the only way you don't do that is if you have real plane and real video. If you have a fake plane and real video, or if you have a real plane and fake video, or if you have a fake plane and fake video, all 3 of those are forms of video fakery. So when Rob Balsamo wants to insist, even after I've defined these terms, that pilots will never buy into video fakery, when he knows that Flight 175 was over Pittsburgh, he's adopting an incoherent position. This is very embarrassing, in my opinion. I mean, I taught logic, critical thinking, scientific reasoning for 35 years. And if I had a student who, after I have defined the term video fakery as meaning one or another of the 3 combinations, fake plane, real video, real plane, fake video, fake plane, fake video, when he knows that Flight 175 was over Pittsburgh, then something's wrong with his capacity to reason, to think clearly. He's got some emotional problem that is warping his rationality, because it's a completely irrational view, and it's not complicated to understand. Once you know that Flight 175 was over Pittsburgh, and once you know that there's something shown in the video that is alleged to be Flight 75 in New York at the same time, you have to accept the conclusion that video fakery, as I am defining it, took place. Now, people want to impose their own meaning on video fakery to say, well, they put this image in 40 or 50 different videos. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can have as many cameras as you want, but if you got a fake plane, a simulated plane, and that's what it appears to be, and I can go into that, where it may have been a missile that was cloaked with what looked like a plane, using a special kind of holographic imagery, or just simply a very sophisticated hologram itself.
Which, by the way, they're admitting that they have now. So if they're, and you know this being a former Marine Corps officer, Jim, if they're admitting that they have it now, this technology is at least 20 to 30 years old already. So
That's
they would have
exactly
had it
right,
on the day of 9/11, correct?
You're exactly right. A very, very nice point. So what no planes theory really means is none of the officially claimed planes crashed on 9/11. It's got 4 parts. Number one, Flight 11 didn't hit the North Tower. Flight 77 didn't hit the Pentagon. Flight 93 didn't crash into Shanksville. Flight 175 didn't hit the South Tower. That's what no planes theory means. It means no big Boeings. It doesn't mean there weren't any planes anywhere. I mean, that would be silly. We know that a plane flew toward the Pentagon and then swooped over it. I even have the trucker buddy of a friend of mine from JFK Research who was actually right there in front of the Pentagon and saw this plane fly toward the Pentagon and then swoop over it. CIT, the Citizens Investigative Team, has found, a dozen witnesses who saw this plane come in too high in the air to hit any lampposts north of the Citgo station. If the official count were true, it would have to have been south of the Citgo station. And they saw it fly toward the Pentagon. Now, some of them thought it hit the Pentagon because they saw explosions when the plane got right there in the vicinity. So it was easy to see. You see a plane heading toward that big explosion, you think it's cause and effect, but it actually swooped over it. In fact, pilots got flight data information from the National Transportation Safety Board and studied it and discovered that it corresponded to a plane on a completely different trajectory. The official account is an acute northeast trajectory. It was just skimming the ground, nearly 500 miles an hour, hitting these lampposts, and nevertheless, its trajectory is not affected. Well, this is ridiculous. This is a violation of laws of aerodynamics. A plane at that speed would be generating ground defect, which is a pocket of compressed gas that would keep it about 60 feet above the air. It could not have been low enough to hit any of those lampposts. Moreover, the effect of a plane flying 500 miles an hour hitting a lamppost is the same as a lamppost moving 500 miles an hour hitting a stationary plane. It would have ripped the wing off of the plane. The fuel stored in the wing would have burst into fire. It would have cartwheeled, its tail broken off, damaged the lawn. The Pentagon lawn is completely clear, clean, unblemished, no debris. The debris only starts showing up later. Popeye, it's a scam. And you just have to look at the evidence, which is why
I got to wonder why they trucked in dirt that day, Jim, and started dumping dirt on a fresh crime scene.
Yeah. It's like getting rid of the JFK limousine. That was done already Monday, the day of the formal state funeral. It was taken back to Ford Motor Company, ripped down to bare metal, and replaced, including the windshield, which had a through-and-through hole in it.
That guy from the Ford Motor Company even attested to the fact that...
Yeah. Doug Weldon, who's now deceased, a J.D., an attorney from Kalamazoo, Michigan, did brilliant research on this. His article about the Lincoln limousine is published in Murder in Dealey Plaza, which many have told me they regard as the single best volume ever published on the assassination. It's one of the 3 books I edited, which even Vince Bugliosi, who's one of the leading lone nutters, who authored this humongous book called Reclaiming History, acknowledges are the only 3 exclusively scientific books ever published on the assassination. So, I'm just telling you, if you're willing to believe in violations, I often say the official account of 9/11 is just fine as long as you're willing to believe impossible things. And these, the official trajectory and hitting these lampposts is preposterous. It's not physically possible. That's part of the official account. This other plane flying toward the building, swooping over it, is completely possible and appears to be exactly what happened. It's like you go back to the Twin Towers, Popeye. The reason they had to fake it is no real plane could have got completely into the buildings before they exploded. It's hard enough to hit a 208-foot wide target when you're flying at high speed. And officially, according to pilots, that plane was traveling like 500 miles an hour at 700 to 1,000 feet altitude. That, again, is not even aerodynamically possible at that altitude because the air is so thick that the turbines can't suck it through the engines and they start functioning as brakes.
You think it was a cruise missile or a drone?
Well, no, it can't have been a drone. You see, it can't have been a drone because a drone's a real plane, and no real plane could intersect those 8 floors and actually get into the building. It would have crumpled, its wings and tail broken off. It might have been a cruise missile. I've been inclined to believe that it was a sophisticated hologram, and I even got a student from Cambridge who had just taken a course in holography named Stephen Brown, whom I interviewed on The Real Deal, So if you go to radiofetzer.blogspot.com, you can put in a search for Stephen Brown, and you can find the interview where we discussed it. And he told me after this course at Cambridge that the technology existed in 2001 for a sophisticated hologram to have been used. And of course, when you project a sophisticated hologram, you could project it faster than a real plane could fly. You could project it to disappear into a building without any collision effects in violation of Newton's laws of motion, especially the third law, the equal and opposite reaction law, which means that this plane, aluminum plane, hitting this 500,000-ton building at 500 miles an hour would have the same effect as if the plane were stationary and were hit by a 500,000-ton building moving at 500 miles an hour. The effects are the same. It would have crumpled, its wings broken off, body, seats, and luggage fallen to the ground. Maybe the engines would have gone in. Would you believe that they try to claim that the evidence, some of the strongest evidence that the plane was a real plane, is because an engine component was found at Church and Murray Street? Except, Popeye, get this, it's not from a 767. It's sitting on the sidewalk, which is not shattered. If it had come from that, had high speed and high distance, it would have shattered the concrete. It's underneath a steel scaffolding. You get this. Jack White, who's a legendary photo analyst from JFK, discovered Fox News footage showing a white van there and men in FBI vests unloading something heavy. This was a planted engine component, Popeye, but they didn't know enough to get it right. I even feature that in these articles.
I actually have photos of said engine piece from that day. A steel worker that was there at the day that I know gave me his camera, his throwaway camera, a long time ago. And I've had these photos, and I gave a bunch of them actually to Stephen Jones. I sent them to him a couple of years ago because there was stuff from inside in the basements and everything. And Stephen Jones even said that he was impressed by some of the photos, that there was a bunch of evidence in there. I'll have to send you them, Jim. You could check them out. But that said engine piece is there, and in the picture you see all these guys with sunglasses standing around it. So it's interesting that you say that. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 of today's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from FederalJack.com. It is Friday, May 18th, 2012, and Professor Jim Fetzer is joining me today. He's been hanging out for hour number 1. We're geared up, ready to go for hour number 2, and I want to get right back into the contentious issue of video fakery on 9/11, Jim. And I think you've done an extremely good job of explaining that when you say video fakery, you're not saying that something didn't hit the building, but you're saying what they're saying hit the building and what they're portraying is crap. And I want to remind people that Coachella this year, they had a dead man dancing and rapping right along next to Snoop Dogg. Okay, so if they're showing you that, remember what I told you in hour number 1, that what you're seeing and what you're exposed to is old technology. So if you're seeing it, they've already had it for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, you got to bear in mind that, whatever might have appeared to have hit the building, the South Tower in particular, because that's where we have the most extensive footage. But I can say things about the North Tower, too, cannot have been a real plane. I mean, it cannot have been a real plane because it's performing feats that no real plane could perform. It's entering the building, its complete length, in the same number of frames that it passes through its own length in air. That means this massive 500,000-ton steel and concrete building is providing no more resistance to the trajectory of this aluminum aircraft than air. That is preposterous. Now, as I mentioned before, it's intersecting with 8 different floors, each of which consists of a steel truss filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. That's enormous horizontal resistance. So that the plane should have crumpled, its wings and tail broken off, body, seats, and luggage falling to the ground. Its engines, which are quite massive, might very well have entered the building, but most of it would not. The windows in the Twin Towers were rather narrow because they didn't want to allow a lot of heat into the building, which would have run up air conditioning astronomically. So that, less than 50% of the building is glass. I mean, substantially less. So that even on the most optimistic account, you wouldn't have had, even 50% of the plane entering the building. Now, Some people say it's mistaken to talk about this 500,000-ton building because it's only hitting, those 8 floors or whatever. But I say, well, that's a really grossly wrong conception. I mean, suppose you had a car driving really, really fast and it runs into a massive tree. Not only do you not expect the car to pass through the tree, you expect the car to be mangled. And in part it's because the tree has massive resistance because it's rooted into the ground. Well, that building was rooted into the ground. It was like 7 floors below the ground. The steel was 6 inches, 5 tapered on the way up.
That's a good point, Jim.
Yeah, it is.
No, really, because I used to do accident recovery for a long time. That's a really good point. I've seen cars hit a solid concrete pole, and the pole didn't collapse into its own footprint. The car bounced off. I mean, there might have been some structural damage to the pole, but the car obviously bore the brunt because it was the weaker of the two materials, and physics kicked in.
Let me draw an analogy, Popeye. Suppose you had a stack of coins, 50-cent pieces, 10 or whatever, then quarters, and then nickels, and then pennies, and then dimes, okay? This theory is that you're only hitting some of those, say, nickels or dimes, and therefore you could knock them out as though the plane could... But the building is an intricate, welded, bolted, solid lattice structure. In order to have an analogy with a stack of coins, you'd have to weld the coins together. And then you can begin to appreciate why if something hit the stack, it's the whole stack that is posing the resistance because it's welded together. It's a single, massive, 500,000-ton building in the case. So no real plane could do that. So it can't be a real plane. It can't be a modified plane. It can't be a special plane. It can't be a drone. It can be none of the above. Could it have been a cruise missile? Well, I'm willing to allow that it could have been a cruise missile, but it has to be cloaked or enveloped in the image of a plane. Why? Well, because there are an awful lot of witnesses who claim they saw a plane. Now, some said it was a small, some a large, some a military, some a civilian. The number who said, it was what, United Flight 175 or a United aircraft entering the building was the same as the number who said they saw a missile fired from the Woolworth building into the North Tower, namely exactly 1. But if you find any witness who's a credible witness who says they saw a plane, then video fakery in the sense that many people suppose you mean is ruled out. Because if there was video fakery in the sense that most people mean, there wouldn't have been something in the air for people to see. It would only have been broadcast. So there are 3 different theories about how this was done. One was the use of computer-generated images, which originated with Rosalie Grable, who did the best work on Flight 11 and the Naudet brothers film, which I can address briefly. Then Ace Baker suggested it was video compositing. So you got this, live feed, and before it goes out, you add the image of a plane to it, you composite it in. But the third is the use of some sophisticated hologram. And I say, well, the reason why...
I go with number 3 because...
Well, the more witnesses who report having seen a plane, Popeye, the more it's incompatible with those 2 other alternatives. But I'll tell you this, it is possible that they used this simulated image, even if it was cloaking a cruise missile, to hit the building and then tweaked the footage, too, before it went out. I mean, both are possible together. So some of these cases, you got to realize it's not exclusively A or B or C, but it can be a combination. Just as there's some reason to think that the way in which the Twin Towers were destroyed may have been a combination of mini nukes with some kind of maybe sophisticated high-tech kind of directed energy weapon that maybe triggered off the mini nukes or whatever, did some other damage. I mean,
I don't know if there was. I don't buy into the whole directed energy weapon thing, but I do think that there was probably a use of between C4 and some other explosives that we just don't know of. Military grade stuff.
C4 wouldn't do it, Popeye. Listen.
I mean military grade stuff.
No, listen to me. According to the government, the Twin Towers collapsed, right? It was because of the combined effects of the plane hitting the building, the fires, and then the top floors falling down. Okay, well, this is wrong on so many counts. For one, the fires didn't burn long enough or hot enough to even cause the steel to weaken, much less melt. In fact, underwriters' laboratories had certified the steel used in the building to 2,000 degrees for 3 or 4 hours. And when they tested it, it didn't even weaken, much less melt. And in fact, that was tested in 1975. There was a huge fire in the North Tower on the 11th floor that burned for like 4 hours at around 2,000 degrees. And when it was over, they didn't even have to replace the steel. Now, this is when they decided, by the way, to install the sprinkler system. And what's fascinating about the sprinkler system, Popeye, is that there were explosions in the sub-basements of both buildings 14 and 17 seconds before the alleged plane hits.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What's his name? Rodriguez. Willie Rodriguez can attest to that fact.
Willie Rodriguez reported it, but
he's a big key to this whole thing.
Yeah, but in fact, there were two scholars, Gordon Ross and Craig Furlong, who followed it up. They got very precise seismic data from a Lamont lab run by Columbia University, and they got very precise FAA and radar data from the government. And they found that these explosions occurred 14 and 17 seconds before the alleged plane hits. And it was when Willie was here and we had dinner together and he told me how he watched the water fill up the sub-basements that I realized that the principal purpose of those explosions was to drain the sprinkler systems of water, because otherwise they would have been able to extinguish the very, very modest fires that remained after the jet fuel, which had to have been pre-positioned in the building, was consumed in those spectacular fireballs. I mean, that only went about 15 seconds, and then all that jet fuel is gone, Popeye. I mean,
see, that goes to show you the level of forethought that went into this, Jim.
Yes.
Because if they thought about blowing the tanks or blowing the lines or whatever to drain the sprinkler systems and whatever else, perhaps take it, help damage some support column or whatever, but definitely drain the water out of the sprinkler system. Yeah. That just goes to show that there's a really sophisticated level of forethought to take these buildings down.
Very much so.
And the whole theory of 19 guys being directed from some jerk off in a cave with a satellite phone and a friggin' laptop on a dialysis machine is just completely off the mark.
It's ludicrous.
It's completely insane. We're going to get cut off by the break. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. More with Professor Jim Fetzer when we get back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. And during the break, Jim and I were discussing the fact that there was nuclear waste, fresh kills. Now, if you don't know what fresh kills is, fresh kills out in Staten Island, it was a landfill, and that was where they took all the debris from 9/11. And then it got, got sorted through, and most of the steel got shipped off and everything else to different countries.
Well. Now, that's an interesting question, Popeye, because I'm not convinced. The claim that steel was shipped off, I think, may be an excuse to cover the fact that the steel was actually vaporized. That it was, you got this this nanothermite business. When I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December 2005, I invited Steve Jones to be my co-chair. He's a guy who championed the nanothermite theory, that it had been responsible for the destruction of the Twin Towers. But it turns out, I was skeptical then. And in fact, by the end of the year, I had begun to broaden the scope of the theories to be considered in relation to the Twin Towers. Steve and his buddies didn't like that. We had a huge falling out, and they created a separate organization. But it turns out that I was right, that nanothermite cannot have done it, Popeye, and it's for the following simple reason. A chemical engineer named T. Mark Hightower and I were in a small research group on nanothermite. And Mark knew the literature and discovered that the highest known detonation velocity for nanothermite is only 895 meters per second. Well, it's a principle of material science that you can't destroy a material unless you have an explosive with a detonation velocity equal to the speed of sound in that material. Well, in concrete, the speed of sound is 3,200 meters per second. In the case of steel, 6,100 meters per second. That means nanothermite cannot possibly have been responsible for blowing apart the Twin Towers. And yet, here's one of the greatest, lies that the government has told us. They claim that the Twin Towers collapsed. Well, look at the visible footage.
No, they were blown apart.
A collapse operates in one direction, Popeye, downward. Go and watch, this is in orange, and you'll see Building 7 collapse. It's a 47-story building. All the floors come down at the same time. When it's over, there's a pile of debris equal to about 12% of the height of the original, or around 5 floors. In the case of Twin Towers, 12% of 110 would be 14, about 14 floors. But those buildings were actually destroyed below ground zero. I had Father Frank Morales on my show twice, an earlier radio show. He was a first responder from St. Mark's Church, and he observed that those buildings were destroyed below ground level. If you look at some of the photographs down on Building 6, And over to the left, which has got this big hole in the middle of it, and over to the left, you can see the pile of debris from Building 7, and to the right, where Building 1, the North Tower, used to be, there's nothing. There's nothing. There's not even a pile of debris equal to that of the 47-story building. This was a 110-story building. The reason there's no pile of debris is those buildings were converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust, and nanothermite cannot have done it.
Nope. I agree. I don't think thermite turn the buildings to dust. I think at the most thermite would have been used to cut the support columns with that angled cut, which you've seen. There's evidence of that on in the early.
Yeah, but I think that was from the cleanup, Popeye. I've seen all those photographs.
Well,
right?
I mean, maybe it was used to cut the beams at the most, but I don't. There's no way it could have taken out concrete. There had to be some massive explosive force. And if you watch, Jim, you know what I'm talking about. If you watched when the towers come down, if you watch it, if you slow it down, even just slow it down just a little bit, you can see that you can see the squibs and the explosions going out, 30 floors below it. And you can see that the floors just turn to dust at like 10 floors per second.
That's right. Now, I think that, they were blowing out 10 floors at a time, and there were 11 10-floor segments. And that's why it happened in about 11 seconds. I mean, you got, each one takes about a second to blow 10 floors, then 10 floors, then 10 floors. Let me tell you how absurd the collapse theory is. I've got a retired high school physics, chemistry, and math teacher by the name of Chuck Baldwin. I featured him on my radio show many times. Chuck has done some impressive work, studying the structure of these buildings and emphasizing, for example, how the steel is tapered so it's 6 inches thick and then 5, 4, and so forth. Up toward the top, it gets like a half-inch, quarter-inch thick. Now, what that means is there's much less mass of steel at the top than at the bottom. According to the official account, for example, in relation to the North Tower, the plane hits, it's intersecting 7 floors, but suppose you say that it's actually hitting around the 96th floor. Then you got 14 floors above. According to the government, those 14 floors are supposed to have collapsed because of the fire, which didn't burn hot enough or long enough to cause the steel to even weaken, much less melt. And that 14 floors is supposed to have overwhelmed the rest of the building. Well, let me give you a few clues. That top 14 floors represents 1.4% of the mass of the steel. There's the idea that it would overwhelm the lower 98.6 is a manifest absurdity. And it wouldn't even build up enough speed. I mean, Chuck tried to do a calculation of how far that building, that 14 floors would have had to fall. And it was, 106 miles it would have had to fall, if it were falling with no air resistance whatever, in accordance with Galileo's law of free fall, to try to build up enough momentum. Well, it wasn't falling from, 106 miles. It was right there. Not only that, but John Skilling, who was an engineer on the firm that constructed, the building, said that they were built with a safety factor of 20. That means every single floor of the building could support 20 times its expected live load, which is the dead load, unoccupied, plus the people, furniture, equipment, computers, and all that to make the live load. So if you're talking about the 100th floor, it could carry 20 times more than the 10 floors above it. And, of course, 20 times 10 is 200 floors. I mean, this whole idea that this was a collapse is completely and totally physically absurd. And yet this is what they've marketed to the American people. Listen to this, Popeye. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has carried the heavy water for the government on this, did a study of 236 samples of the steel that they selected. They found 233 had not been exposed to temperatures above 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature of an ordinary office fire. And the other 3 not above 1,200 degrees. But I told you already that UL had certified the steel up to 2,000 for 3 to 4 hours, where the fires only burned in the South Tower for about an hour and then the North for about an hour and a half. The whole thing is preposterous. We have been sold such a bill of goods, and it's insulting. It's absolutely insulting that they have tried to market this rubbish to the American people. I mean, this was a major event. It changed U.S. foreign policy, which was the objective, to try to, get us from a tradition where we never attacked any country that hadn't attacked us, to create a phony, baloney claim that we'd have been attacked by 19 Islamic terrorists. By the way, 15 of those alleged 19 in the list appears to have been given to the government, to the FBI, by the Mossad. Okay, Israel had a very important role in the planning and execution of 9/11, although Dick Cheney appears to have been the principal coordinator from an underground bunker beneath the White House. 15 of those 19 were from Saudi Arabia. The number from Iraq was 0. How dumb are we supposed to be? If they were from Saudi Arabia, 15 of the 19, why weren't we invading Saudi Arabia? The whole fact is it was a sham. Paul, O'Neill, as I mentioned before in his book, The Price of Loyalty, was explaining that not only was the Bush and Cheney administration talking about invading Iran from the time of their very first cabinet meeting. You may recall that Cheney organized this energy policy meeting, and he wouldn't even allow the country to know who was coming in, the heads of these big oil countries. They were actually talking about how they were going to subdivide Iraq in relation to the oil that was going to be made available there. And he wouldn't even let people know, who was meeting. I mean, what kind of transparency in government? This is a form of gross corruption. In fact, Paul O'Neill said of the Bush administration in relation to the country that the corruption was so profound that he actually would describe it as a form of looting. And would you believe, I think all this talk about Iraq actually was a cover story. Paul O'Neill said the whole time he was there, he felt that there were things going on beneath the surface that you couldn't see. When Osama bin Laden was confronted, asked about 9/11, he said he had nothing to do with it. That was contrary to the tenets of Islam to murder innocent women and children, but that there was a government within the government that wanted to blame it on Islam, on Muslims, in order to generate a war in the Middle East. Would you believe even
Jim, I'm going to cut you off right there because we're coming up to the break. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. We will be right. Jim was talking about bin Laden and how he had said that there was a shadow government. And Jim, that reminds me of Cooper's quote where he's talking about 9/11, and he says he's talking about the insanity of the bin Laden story. The story. He says that, the most sophisticated government, technology, spy agency, military in the world can't find this guy, yet some doofus jerk-off reporter from CNN just happens to bump into him and get led to his mountain hideout. It's just such ridiculousness.
Well, even before his death, he was interviewed in a hospital in Dubai by CIA. I mean, Al-Qaeda and Osama were our boys in Afghanistan and driving the Russians out, the Soviets out. We gave them, organized through arms dealers to create an intermediary, these Stinger missiles, to take down the Soviet helicopters, and it was just too expensive for the Soviets to stay there, so they had to withdraw. Now, that's actually, let me just tie off one or two ends, and then I'll get into this Afghanistan thing, because it leads directly into it, which is this. Someone else who said there was a government within the government is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton said there's a government within the government, and I don't control it. Now, that's Bill Clinton. You got it from Osama bin Laden. You got it from Paul O'Neill. He said he was there and things were going on and he didn't know what was going on. And I'll tell you, they were not only out to loot the United States, but they were out to loot the world. And that gets us to this Afghanistan thing, because I had some time back learned that there's maybe the world's largest deposit of lithium in Afghanistan. Another huge deposit is in Bolivia. But this lithium is incredibly valuable. It is used for electric car batteries. It's used as components in computers and for detonators for nuclear weapons. But also it appears to be used in a process to convert, cheap sources of energy like water into energy. Okay, so it's huge. And it's one of the world's largest deposits. So I'm doing research on this, and I find that there was an article published in the New York Times on 13 June 2010 entitled, U.S. Identifies Vast Mineral Riches in Afghanistan. So that not only does Afghanistan have this vast deposit of lithium, but it also has enormous deposits of iron and of copper and of gold, okay? And it turns out that they actually... They learned this from the Soviet incursion, because there were maps that Soviet mining engineers had that were kept secreted and they given to the U.S. And I'm quite convinced that the reason we're there and that the reason that we're not going to get out until 2024 is because we're going to stay there until we've stolen all the lithium, all the gold, all the copper, all the iron. In other words, we're looting Afghanistan. There's no military reason whatsoever to be in Afghanistan. There are, however, powerful political reasons. Once you understand that the CIA is the biggest drug-running operation in the world, Military officers have returned to the U.S. in disgust because they were ordered to protect the poppy crop. They're protecting the poppy crop because the CIA is benefiting from it. And they are there, these forces, to mine the mineral riches of Afghanistan. It's got nothing to do with any threat from Afghanistan.
And by the way, Jim, lithium is used, like you said, not only in just the things that you listed, but every electronic device out there pretty much, because anything with a battery, lithium is used. Almost every electronic device uses lithium in one form or another. So can you imagine the amount of money that's out there in lithium? And I think it's funny because about a year and a half ago, Rachel Maddow did a segment about this where somebody had said there's a ton of raw materials out there like lithium and all this other stuff, iron, and they were going through this, and Rachel Maddow on air goes, lithium? I can't understand why anybody would really care about a ton of lithium. Meanwhile, she's playing with like her iPad, on the TV while she's
being sarcastic.
Yeah, no, she wasn't being sarcastic. She was actually.
You mean ignorant? She didn't.
I don't think it's ignorant. If she's ignorant, then she shouldn't be reporting. I think it's controlled ignorance, if you want to put it that way. But she did. She almost like poo-pooed it, like, oh, who cares about lithium? And it's just amazing that the mainstream media doesn't talk about this. They don't talk about the amount of stuff that's there.
Listen to this, Popeye. Now, this article was published on June 13, 2010, but we knew that these vast riches were in Afghanistan before 9/11.
I think that's the article she was referencing, so she was probably making reference.
Well, listen to me. Here's the deal. I have so much been focusing on Iraq, but that didn't begin until March of 2003. Because Saddam's killed about 3 weeks after the invasion of Iraq by Chris Wachter and his B-1 bomber. And then they got a substitute, one of his doubles to have the public trial and the hanging and all that. And they may have even told him that they were going to send him off to the South Pacific, to Tahiti, where he can drink Mai Tais. And they claimed they were going to do a fake hanging. But what's the simplest way to get rid of the guy? You actually do hang him. So instead of, his falling, short distance before the rope tightens up onto a little stand, you simply pull away the stand. I mean, what could be simpler? And then you got a bona fide hanging, and the guy who was the dupe, really is out of the way, no problem whatsoever. Get this, Popeye. 9/11 occurs, and on the 7th of October, this is less than a month later, we are already invading Afghanistan. We are already invading Afghanistan. Now, it takes a huge amount of time and effort to plan an invasion. So what O'Neill was sensing was, while there was this talk about Iraq, what was going on beneath the surface was all this planning to invade Afghanistan for all these mineral riches. Here's something else, that we appear to have computer satellites that have the capacity to map mineral deposits on Earth, from up in the sky. And it appears to be the case that when the Bush family bought like 200,000 acres in Paraguay, that it is one of the world's largest deposits of natural gas. Some of us at the time speculate, well, Paraguay doesn't have an extradition treaty. Maybe they're going to go down there and create a mini empire, a big ranch, in Paraguay. But it appears to have been completely different. The Paraguayans don't know that there's this vast deposit of natural gas. This is like insider trading. See, if you got access to all this information about where all these deposits are all over the world, because you have these sophisticated satellites that can do this kind of imaging and study of the geological structure of the Earth, then you can capitalize on it. It's just like knowing, say, that Facebook's going to go on sale, right? And you go ahead and you get early on, or you take some measures, or knowing that 9/11 is going to happen is going to involve United and American Airlines, and their stock is going to drop. Would you believe that Thomas Kearns and for the two chairs, Lee Hamilton, the two chairs of the 9/11 Commission, discovered that there had been put options on United and American, which are, of course, wagers that the stock is going to drop, that it led to millions of dollars in profits And they decide, well, the entity involved in this couldn't possibly have been involved in 9/11 because it was a CIA. I mean, how dumb is that? They got this direct link back to the CIA because they put, these options, these put options on United and American Airlines. And these guys are so naive that they're convinced that, it can't possibly have been, a culpable entity. Well, I mean, this is ridiculous. The CIA was deeply involved in the planning of 9/11. It was a national security event. It was authorized at the highest levels of the American government. The whole idea was to traumatize the American people. And in order to instill us with fear and manipulate us for the sake of promoting a political agenda that involved these wars of aggression completely contrary to past U.S. foreign policy, to invade Afghanistan for the sake of its riches, to loot Afghanistan of this mineral wealth, and then to go into Iraq and take control of Iraqi oil, dismantle the most modern, sophisticated Arab state that was, rivaling Israel for its political influence. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a strong ruler because it was a country made up of factions of the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds. If you didn't have a strong ruler, it's like Yugoslavia under Tito. It's going to factionalize. It's going to break up into smaller little statelets. That's what Israel wanted. So they wanted to use the military power of the United States to bring about an Israeli foreign policy in the Middle East. I mean, Iraq had a very modern health system, national health system. It had a wonderful system of public education. It had a reliable infrastructure providing water and electricity to the Iraqi people. It had antiquities and artifacts dating back thousands of years. And the United States just destroyed it.
Yeah, we bombed them back to the friggin'
for the benefit of Israel. Had nothing to do with U.S. interests.
I'm going to have to cut you off, Jim, because we're going to break. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Final segment coming up. Don't go anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, final segment. Before we get back into it, Jim, I want you to plug your websites and stuff because, we always have a habit of talking pretty much right up to the end of the segment, and I make it a habit of final segment of making the guests plug anything they want before we get back into it. So go ahead, shameless.
Well, that's great, Popeye. In this case, it's real simple. Just do a search on Veterans Today, Jim Fetzer, and you'll get, about 40 articles that I published on Veterans Today. This is my most recent stuff. There's about a dozen on 9/11, a dozen on JFK, and I want to talk about a couple of the most recent. But you'll get access to a whole host of stuff you didn't even realize was taking place. And then, of course, the radio show. I've got like 400 two-hour interviews on all these complex and controversial issues at radiofetzer.blogspot.com. So just go there and start scrolling down, and see if you find something interesting. Because, I mean, those who have discovered, these interviews just really love them. I mean, it's stuff you won't hear anywhere else. And because it's 2 hours, I get into depth with my guests, and we go places that you're not going to hear anyone else go in terms of what's accessible in terms of, the internet. Now, what I was going to add, Popeye, is this stuff about JFK has taken a rather unusual turn. I have a piece up there entitled JFK, What We Know Now That We Didn't Know Then, in which I feature the notes that Will Fritz, who was the homicide detective that interrogated Lee Harvey Oswald, took at the time, which I didn't even know existed, but which the Assassination Records Review Board, this 5-civilian-member panel that was authorized to declassify documents and records held by the CIA, the Secret Service, the FBI, and so forth, were able to release. And they actually managed to get out some 60,000 documents, millions of pages related to this. Now, we don't know how much is left, but they got out a lot of really good stuff. And included in that was these notes that Will Fritz had taken with Lee Oswald. Well, included in those notes are Lee telling Fritz that he was out with Bill Shelley in front. Bill Shelley was a manager of the workers in the book depository. He said he was out with Bill Shelley in front, which can have only meant that he was out there in the doorway watching the motorcade as it took place. Now, this was quite striking because there's been a long-standing debate about one figure in the very famous photograph taken by AP photographer Ike Alshins. where you can see the presidential limousine behind it, the Secret Service vehicle. The Secret Service agents are looking around. You got the vice presidential, though Johnson isn't visible. He appears to have already put himself on the ground because he knew what was going on. You see his security already got a door open, although the Jack's people aren't even responding. There's the window of a broom closet for a uranium mining operation in the Dow Tex. It's kind of bracketed by the fire escape, but that's a location from which 3 shots appear to have been fired. I believe they were the only 3 unsilenced shots that were taken, and I believe they were taken with a man like Carcano by an Anacastro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Escudero. If you go down to Freedom Park in little, Havana in Miami, they have a statue to Jose Marti, who got the Spaniards out of Cuba. But then there's this statue to Tony Escudero. Nobody's ever heard of the guy. And if you ask somebody there, well, who is he? What did he do? Somebody might tell you, well, he took care of business. He fired 3 shots at JFK. One missed and injured the distant bystander, James Tague. Another missed and hit the chrome strip over the windshield. But the third hit JFK in the back of the head. This was after the driver, William Gert, actually brought the limousine to a halt. And Jack fell forward. Jack eased him back up and then was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that blew his brains out to the left rear with such force that Officer Bobby Hargis, hit by that debris, thought he himself had been shot. But the key thing is in the background there, in the doorway, you can see this image that some have thought was Lee Oswald. Others have thought was Billy Lovelady. And in fact, based upon discovering those notes, I started to look into this, and I found an image that showed that a face to the left and ahead of the controverted image had been obfuscated. That led me to infer that had to have been Oswald, so they obscured his face. But I published that then, this image obfuscated in that article, JFK, What We Know Now That We Didn't Know Then. And a chiropractor who actually been doing research on this, I don't know what got him drawn into it, but because he deals with bodies all the time and all that, told me actually that if you study the clothing that the man was wearing, and this guy closest to the edge, who we refer to as Doorway Man, that he's wearing, a shirt and has a slightly pulled-at T-shirt, which was a habit of Lee Oswald, which I learned from Judith Baker, by the way, Popeye, and you did this 6 hours of interviews, that he used to tug at his T-shirt so it looks almost like it's got a V, and that was actually Oswald's clothing, so that unless, Billy Lovelady was wearing Lee's clothes, that was actually Lee Oswald there in the doorway, where, a part of Billy Lovelady's face had been opposed upon him. And this has become a huge controversial issue because there couldn't possibly be a simpler, more straightforward proof that Lee Oswald had been framed for the assassination than to have a photograph of him watching the motorcade as the shooting was taking place.
Yeah, see, there's so much stuff that nobody knows about the JFK assassination, Jim, that, I would have to do a 12-hour show just to cover the amount of fallacies that are out there and all the crap, weed through the crap out there, because there's a lot of disinfo and stuff out there.
Oh, of course, absolutely. In fact, when I got into this, seriously in 1992, when in the wake of the tremendous resurgence of interest in the case because of Oliver Stone's film JFK, and put together a research group consisting of best qualified individuals to ever study the case, a world authority on the human brain, who was also an expert on wound ballistics, a PhD in physics, who was also board certified in radiation oncology, which is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy. He was an expert on X-rays, a physician who actually had been present in trauma room number 1 when they were attempting to save the moribund president, and then 2 days later was responsible in trauma room 2 for the treatment of his alleged assassin, a legendary photo analyst, an expert on all the films, and another PhD in physics, this time in electromagnetism, who made some sensational discoveries about the faking of the Zapruder film. And I found there was this superabundance of evidence, but it was all inconsistent and contradictory, so that what became most important about our work was sorting out the authentic from the inauthentic evidence. And we managed to discover, for example, right off the bat, David W. Manick was going into the National Archives. He's a PhD MD, and discovered that the autopsy x-rays had been altered. that a patch had been imposed of this massive blowout at the back of his head, and that there were actually indications of 2 shots to the head, the other being a pattern of metallic particles from that shot that entered the right temple. In fact, David has at this point in time discovered that all of the JFK autopsy x-rays are dupes or fake, that none of them are authentic, even though according to the National Archives, those are all the original x-rays. None of them is an original x-ray. Bob Livingston discovered that the diagrams and photographs of the brain in the National Archives are not of the brain of JFK. I mean, he had, half his brains blown out in Dealey Plaza, and physician after physician at Parkland described, extruding cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue, where the cerebellum is this compact part of the brain right at the base. But if you look at the diagrams and photographs in the National Archives, Popeye, they show an intact cerebellum and a virtually intact complete brain that's actually abnormally large, weighs in at about 1,500 grams, whereas the normal adult male brain is like 1,350. So this was an abnormally large brain, and it didn't show any of the damage. And then, of course, we also discovered all kinds of evidence of the faking of the film, which had to be done because, the driver pulling the limo to a halt to make sure Jack would be killed was such a blatant indication of Secret Service complicity in setting him up that they had to remove it.
Now, Time had that film, and then you were telling me they transferred it to Eastman Kodak and played with it, right?
Well, it's a little more complicated, Popeye.
Well, in like a 2-minute nutshell, because we're almost out of time.
Yeah. Well, officially, they took the Time Life magazine actually bought the film on Saturday, but in fact, it was already in the hands of a secret CIA lab in Rochester, where they did a massive editing job. So that one version, the original version of the film, was taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C. Saturday. It was an 8mm already split film. They had to go out and get an 8mm projector to play it. But then a 16mm unsplit version was brought down from Rochester the following day, which was the altered film. If anyone wants to read about this, 2 articles I'd recommend are the following. One is U.S. government official JFK cover-up film fabrication, where I'm reporting the work of Douglas Horn, who was a senior analyst for military records for the Assassination Records Review Board, who has now subsequently published a 5-volume study of their work called Inside the ARRB. And the other would be Who's Telling the Truth, Clint Hill versus the Zapruder film. Because Clint Hill explained how he rushed forward. Jackie had started to crawl out the back, actually going after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains. And he pushed her back down, lay across the bodies, looked down into this huge, massive, gaping, fist-sized hole in the back of JFK's head, turned to his colleagues and gave him a thumbs down all before the vehicle reached the triple underpass, and all that had to be taken out because once they removed the limo stop, there wasn't enough time to include it. So if you look at those 2 articles, U.S. government official, JFK cover-up film fabrication, and in some versions, JFK, Who's Telling the Truth, Clint Hill, or the Zapruder film, you will understand what I'm talking about and how we know the film has been fake. What I'm saying, Popeye, and it's thematic with our whole conversation, the government has been lying to us about the recent history of the United States. They've lied about JFK. They've lied about 9/11. They lied about the death of Senator Paul Wellstone. I've done a whole separate study.
Jim, I'm going to have to cut you off because we're out of time. I agree. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, before we go, check out Jim's book. Just look it up on Amazon, The Death of Paul Wellstone. It's a great read. I have it myself. Thank you all for listening. See you Sunday. Love you all. We're out.